To make a mini PC, especially one with an i7 or i9 on board, is all about balance. Its CPU can have all the cores and cache of a desktop chip, and it can promise the same high clock speeds to match, but at the end of the day, heat and power are the ultimate arbiters of how well these machines actually perform. Out of the box, they come balanced for energy efficiency, modest temperatures and low fan noise, and that's very sensible. Of course, it's just always more fun to tip the scales. The Mini IT12 from Geekom, as the name suggests, is based on the 12th gen Intel Core CPUs, in this case an i7-12650H along with 32GB of DDR4 3200 and a terabyte of NVMe storage. Like the other Mini IT models I've featured on the channel in the past, Geekom provided this unit for review, but I'm not being paid and my opinion's my own. The Alder Lake based i7 is a 10-core, 16-thread CPU, which breaks down into 6 hyper-threaded P cores and 4 vanilla E cores. It has 24MB of L3 cache, a max turbo of 4.7 GHz, and a TDP of between 35 and 45 watts. It also has onboard Intel UHD Graphics, which is potentially something of a downgrade from the Iris Xe aboard the 11th and 13th gen models. But from a media playback and encoding standpoint, it's still more than capable of handling the latest codecs. Opening the Mini IT12 up, there's a good amount of user-replaceable components in here. The RAM, SSD and Wi-Fi card are all off the shelf, though in this case they're more interesting from a repair and service standpoint than for actual upgrades. There's a SATA header for a 2.5-inch drive, as well as a SATA M.2 slot for 40mm long drives, if you want to bolster your storage capacity without relying on USB external drives. And the wireless card allows for Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2. Externally, the ports are the same as the IT13 and a small upgrade from those on the IT11. The front panel has 2 USB 3.2 Type A ports, one of which supports power delivery, as well as a 3.5mm combo jack. The rear side has a further USB 3.2 Type A USB 2 Type A pair of 40GB USB 4 Type C ports, which can support an external GPU, a pair of HDMI 2 ports, a 2.5GB Ethernet port, and my favourite, a full-sized SD card slot on the side. So, as usual, this is a pretty stacked unit for something small enough for a large jacket pocket, and that sheer density has its downsides. From past experience, I can tell without checking that the TDP limit is going to be the deal breaker for performance users. To help negate this, I downloaded Intel's Extreme Tuning utility. This free download doesn't allow overclocking as such. The H-series CPUs are completely locked down in that area, but that's kinda beside the point. Intel XTU allows us to extend the TDP limit to, well, unlimited, and we can set the turbo boost duration to 128 seconds, up from the default 28. This allows the CPU to hold higher clock speeds for longer, and it will be longer before the P cores need to stop for a breather and let the E cores take over. You can be more granular with these sliders if you have a specific TDP limit in mind, but in my experience, most of these mini PCs can handle having the slider maxed out. Unfortunately, thermal limits will still apply, so the CPU still won't achieve 4.7 GHz all the time. Ideally, we'd also be able to undervolt the CPU and therefore reduce its heat output with XTU, but although the controls are there, they remain greyed out. To find out how the Mini IT12 performs out of the box and maxed out with XTU, I started with CPU Z. And the results are pretty impressive, with stock single-thread scores in the high 600s and multi-cores around 3.9K. Actually, they look to start a bit higher than that, but towards the end of the test, they throttle hard. Over the course of 10 runs, the multi-core score falls to a low of under 3200, over 30% lower than the first run. This still puts the Mini IT12 about 60% above the previous gen equivalent, but is over 40% slower than the 13th gen i9 model. Cranking up the TDP, however, has a big impact, as throttling is now less of an issue. There's less deviation between the highest and lowest score. The 5087 multi-core average is more than double that of the IT11, a PC which doesn't seem to work with any version of XTU I could find, and which I couldn't get to exceed its rated TDP without it overheating and shutting down. Cinebench R23 is less prone to throttling affecting the result over time, but it does still severely impact performance. The single-core score is almost unchanged regardless of TDP limits, only increasing by less than 2%. The multi-core score test is what benefits the most, and boy howdy. At stock, the score is 4990, less than 5% improved from the old Mini IT11. With the limits off, that rockets up to 11k, more than double the IT11 and within 1,000 points of the IT13. Geekbench is a curious one. Its single and multi-core scores trend about as you'd expect, with the IT12 scoring about 2400 points in single thread and over 9.6k in multi-threaded. This slots it fairly neatly between the other two Intel-based Geekoms. What is curious is that the XTU tuning didn't do a thing to them. Even the GPU tests in both OpenCL and Vulkan appear to do basically nothing with the extra power. 3DMark is rough on the Mini IT12. As a gaming-style benchmark, it biases somewhat in favour of the GPU, and that's one area where the older 11th Gen i7 had the edge over the 12th Gen. At stock settings, the IT12 scores almost 1,000 points higher in the CPU test, but trails 200 points behind in graphics, which translates into the overall score being almost 300 points behind the older model. Upping the TDP increases the CPU score by a whopping 60%, but the overall score barely budges. Of course, the 13th Gen has both the TDP control and Iris Xe graphics, so it wins either way. And it feels rude even mentioning the Ryzen 7840HS at this point. The story is similar in Firestrike, as you might expect, but the XTU tuning makes even less of a difference, with the CPU score being basically unaffected by the increased TDP. Moving into real-world apps, and it's not good news for the Mini IT12 out of the box. Blender leans entirely on the CPU, which means the 12th Gen only beats its predecessor by about 10 seconds, which in a 20-minute render isn't all that noticeable. Loading up the XTU settings and holy shit, that knocked about 11 minutes off the render time and puts the 12th Gen i7 a few seconds ahead of the 13th Gen i9. Of course, the i9 was thermal throttling, and the better-cooled 13th Gen i5 beats it by a minute, but this is still a pretty damn impressive result for the IT12, and all for just a couple of clicks. I wish the story was quite so rosy in DaVinci Resolve, and it is. Again, at stock settings, the IT12 doesn't really make a case for itself over the 11, basically breaking even in the CPU-based H264 test, and actually losing in H265, again due to the weaker UHD graphics. Turning up the TDP is like pressing a turbo button, basically halving the CPU render time from 49.5 minutes to 24.5. The GPU render shaves about 2¾ minutes off its time, which, while a less impressive margin, does at least beat the Iris Xe on the 11th Gen. In gaming, the Mini IT11 exhibits the same behaviour as its predecessor, at least out of the box. Many games start off poorly as shaders cache and data is accessed, which, when TDP limited, the chip struggles to handle. I don't benchmark Apex Legends when it's chugging along at 6 FPS and pausing for several seconds at a time. I wait for the next run, where everything's a bit more settled down and sees a 60 plus average FPS. Turning up the TDP not only removes that agonising first pass, it also improves frame pacing, as while the average is actually slightly lower than before, the 1% and 0.1% lows are much improved. BattleBit Remastered, however, is kind of a counterexample. It needs so little in the way of resources that it can thrive on the IT12 in either the stock configuration or with XTU tuning. It averages basically the same 106 FPS in both scenarios, and 1% and 0.1% lows are virtually unaffected too. CS2 has exactly the same experience as Apex Legends, but to a lesser degree. The first minute or so of the first match essentially ruins the experience, causing hitching and stuttering all over the place, whereas after that it becomes far more tolerable. Removing the TDP limits has little effect on averages, or even 1% lows, but it does improve the 0.1%, and it also removes that problematic period in the first match where it takes half a second for your screen to update. In Fortnite, the difference is night and day. Bear in mind it's winter here in the UK right now, days are only 8 hours long, and sometimes they look quite a bit like night. The stock experience on the IT12 is awful. The game is borderline unplayable at times, even on a second run. With the XTU tuning, things actually improve by a lot, in both the average FPS and the lows. Once again, Overwatch 2 is painful to play on the first run with the Mini IT12. In fact, the second run is still pretty bad. 0.1% lows in particular never seem to get good until you lift the TDP limits, and then things improve significantly. While averages don't look like a massive improvement, 1% and particularly 0.1% lows show what a big deal this is. Of course, gaming isn't all esports. I don't imagine everyone who buys one of these as a home office PC is a secret CSGO veteran, so I took the opportunity to try out a few indie and lower spec games on Xbox Game Pass. Palworld is apparently pretty popular right now, and will presumably continue to do so until Nintendo's lawyers hear about it. Sadly, it's a bit much for this system. I dropped it to 480p low and couldn't get it to stick to 30 FPS, and it would only run that resolution in a window. I had higher hopes for 2023's surprise hit Hi-Fi Rush too, but even at 720 low it was also only good for a fairly unsteady 30 FPS, and my timing's bad enough even at 60. Rollerdrome is a great time, a kinda Max Payne Pro Skater mashup with a distinctive lo-fi visual style that's very light on system requirements, and at 1080p I could get an average FPS in the mid-70s. Guilty Gear Strive looks like it might be good for 60 FPS, but at lower resolutions than I tested. At 720p it was still only running in the high 40s and low 50s. Cocoon was very well reviewed, being a 3D puzzler with a minimalist art style that looks surprisingly good for a title that can run at a fairly solid 1080p 60. 2D titles are naturally no problem at all, so if you want to indulge in some nostalgic visual styles, then games like Spirit Tea and Sea of Stars will prove to be no hassle for this PC at all. And of course, if you want to give in to your nostalgia completely, there's always Emulation. The i7-12650H can handle GameCube very well, with even the super demanding Rogue Leader being largely stutter-free. Nintendo Wii should likewise do fine, even upscaled to 1080p, though Tatsunoko vs Capcom does show its usual major slowdowns when there's lots of effects on screen. Wii U emulator Cemu can run Mario Kart 8 superbly at 1080p, with only some mild shader compilation glitches in between races. So I guess it's not really a surprise to anyone that giving a processor more power makes it run better, but the appeal of these mini PCs is not exclusively in their performance. Obviously, giving it access to more power means it uses more power. Under load, the stock config briefly consumes about 70 watts, before settling in the mid-50s once the E-cores take over. The result of the TDP increase means the CPU is still consuming about 75 watts, but now for a longer duration. Of course, this can't help but have an effect on temperatures. In extended workloads like Blender, the package hovers in the 80s at stock settings, whereas dropping the limits in XTU causes them to rocket into the 90s and peak at over 100 degrees. Realistically, I don't think I can responsibly say that removing the TDP limit is okay for long-term intensive applications. It's less of an issue in gameplay as there's virtually no discernible impact. Temps generally hang out in the mid to high 70s, very rarely venturing into the 80s for a moment in some cases, but otherwise very much under control, regardless of whether XTU is being used or not. The Mini IT12 currently sells on Geekom's site for $549 or £509, and there are discount codes in the description to get an additional $30 or pounds off. If you were in the market for a higher-end Intel-based mini PC, these are definitely worthy of consideration. There's plenty of options for expansion, a good range of connectivity, and enough power for even heavier productivity tasks, though that last part is very contingent on it being tuned correctly and your own personal tolerance for higher temperatures. If you want a small, powerful premium PC that's more suited for gaming, there are better options, one of which I'll be reviewing in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.